So this is the Air Force Band. In light of that, it's all low instruments. He simply marks it with a legato for 4 bars and another 4-bar legato. You can try and assess what you hear the Air Force Band doing. Okay, let's see if I can hold it still. Well, that really ruins the point if the system starts, right? Especially if this next one. I'll run it again, it's short. Okay, now John, maybe you have real skill at this that I don't. Okay, so that's the Air Force Band, and we're going to go down to this one. See if you can get that one going. The dynamics are important. So. Is that what's doing it? Finding how to get it out. Okay. That'll be great. Okay, I'm not sure how well that came across, but what I think you hear, besides a quicker tempo in the Air Force Band, that's about, I had this mapped out as well, it's about 104 to the quarter note. The second recording, again, I just went to what was in the library, and this recording made my point. This is Rick Clary with the FSU Wind Ensemble last spring. It's not only a more moderate tempo, it's more legato, and he very clearly shapes some of those notes along, something along the lines I was describing. A nice decrescendo to the first B flat, and just a little bit off the last B flat to show some shape. And the Air Force Band, I think, seemed to make a conscious point of very even attacks on all the notes, and I mean, make it as simple as possible. I would not advocating one over the other, but I think certainly the contrast suggests there's some things one could think about, right? So scale degree function, just the shape of the line. Again, that can be intuited by just singing lines, which I think is something really helpful. I do remember doing that when I studied scores that I had to conduct to make sure I could hear lines, right? Okay, so overall form, I think, can be a good clue to learning the piece. Some drawing on your hearing of especially tonal melodies, the way scale degree function works. Another very basic thing of theory that you were subjected to with all these rules about doubling and voicing, right? We learn on the part writing, but you know, tell students, the fact is that matters, right? When you actually write, composers sure think about what's doubled and what's not. So on your handout, I hope it include, there should be the last part of the whole suite. Is that on there? The full score? Okay, and if you compare that briefly to the end of the piano reduction, right. First of all those accents in the piano reduction, we're going to come back to some cautionary tales about piano reductions in a moment, but those accents aren't in the regular score, as you may see already. And what's of interest to me is how you want to voice that last chord, especially in lieu of the fact, right, that we have so much high B flat in that, right? Now, if we look at, now referring to your handout, the full score, right? Something very simple, which I find useful to do sometimes. I'm thinking about how, especially the final chord always seems to be important to me. But anytime you're trying to find balance, who's playing what chord member? Right? Roots, fifths, and thirds. How did the composer lay that out? And again, you may come to different conclusions about it depending on how you're looking at it. But what I note in this, and listen to recordings, is how we often get probably by virtue of where the range is. A lot of first cornet or trumpet part, because they're up in the high B flats, a lot of high winds. We really hear F to B flat at the end, right? Which is kind of interesting since that's a noticeable motivic interval at the very beginning, the theme, that it ends on that F to B flat, right? But I remember that passing note D, I kept thinking, well, he never gives us that E flat in any real important position. So you can see what I've marked on the score. Why have I bracketed the first cornet and the trombone parts? Well, first, because in 126, they're doubling one another. But notice that the trombones, as I've marked it, that's unique to the score at that point. They give us what we've not heard the whole piece. 3, 2, 1. The final nice strong movement down to the time scale here, right? Now that's one of those things theorists like to point out when they're looking for structural lines. It doesn't always mean you're going, oh, I should really bring that out. But the fact is, if you listen to some of these different recordings, we can't always know what a conductor's thinking, just like we can't know what a composer's thinking, but we can certainly make some judgments about that. I'll just play the end, and hopefully this will come out nice and clear. The end of, here's the FSU one, I think. Whoops, no, it's not. No, no. Oh, sorry. Just for a change of pace. This is the end of the one by the Dallas Wind Symphony. Once more. Okay, despite the loss of volume. And you can hear pretty clear that he seems to be very attentive to those trombones at the end. And this, of all these other, the 4 recordings I could play, we hear lots of B flat. The Air Force has all those B flats are screaming. But I think he made a nice judgment to more evenly balance the chord and bring out that structural line, right? And just being aware of where those things are and how it's voiced can help you think about how you might color your particular performance in terms of balance, right? So again, I often find I'm talking about very simple fundamentals, right? What's the root, third, and fifth of the chord, right? Okay, this time is flying by. I think I came prepared like I usually tell my students when I teach a class. Have a lot more to do than you have time to do. So let me just try and talk through the handout and some of the points I would hope to make in so doing. If you look, find the last page of the Chester Overture. Right? Again, we simply don't have the time, so I'll leave it to you. I'm sure all of you, probably all of you, have recordings of this. And again, I think if you use recordings, the real value is not to get a recording and drum it into your ear to learn the piece, but to have questions about the score that a recording may suggest answers to, but to compare recordings. You know, I think that's an obvious point, but I think it's really important to compare. We all know the caveats about learning a piece by listening to one recording and you adapt that particular interpretation rather than developing your own. But if you looked at the last page of the Schumann-Chester Overture, once again, all I've done is outline who's playing what chord member. Right? I've bracketed where I'm hearing complete triads in close voicing. Right? And if I were to play through the recordings, you can see this obviously, assuming we're getting a clean recording, that conductors are very attentive to, some of them at least, what they want to bring out. And oftentimes I'm attentive to thirds of chords. Thirds of chords have a real sort of active quality to them. So sometimes I think other conductors sense that because you can really hear them bringing those kind of voicings out. So that's what that particular page was about. Wow. So then if you look at the Chester Overture, given measures 66, I gave 2 pages of score through 66 through about measure 80, and I wanted to go through there. This, as we know, can be a tricky ensemble. We have a lot of unison rhythms and antiphonal passages, right? Again, time will not permit, but as I to go through this in detail, and again, I wish we had the overhead projector, but what I would talk about here particularly is it can't just be a series of discrete events by themselves. For me as a conductor and for the performers, how things group together is a basic issue, right? So this is just not a bunch of measure after measure. And again, grouping structure is something that's also in a lot of rhythmic theories received a lot of attention. And it's one that's really useful in analysis, because one thing we do when we perform, whether to what extent we're conscious of it or not, is we have to decide small things make bigger things and how we group patterns together. This is a particularly interesting example because as at least one published analysis was I cited there talked about was the asymmetrical phrase lengths, the surprising rest, throw things off. And again, in the interest of time, I would just point out I often mark numbers to show how many measures go together. Right? So I mark 1, 2, 3, right? So for example, on the first page of this two-page excerpt, right? The second, third, fourth, and fifth measures, I can make arguments which I don't have time to make, but I listen to those, there's pitch connections, one group to the other, right? And the parts of measure 69 in the trumpets, right, are offbeats, right? And I'm sensitive to what are initiating events and what are reacting to events, right? So that's groups with a preceding event. It's a reaction to it, right? Now, rhythmic analysis is interesting. You might find, people often don't agree on those things, right? But that's why it's interesting. It really becomes a part of your interpretation. Another point which I might break briefly here is just we're attentive to levels of beats, right? So if you find measure 75 for a moment, 75. I think we're really conscious because of the rhythmic motivic pattern. There's yada da 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 da. I'm hearing 1, 2, 1, 2, or if I marked it for the duration, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those 4 beats group together. That's fairly obvious. But the next 3 bars, which go into the next page of the score, it's actually, I think, we best to feel a larger beat. So we go from yada da 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 to da 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 da. Again, a simple point, but I find being attentive to that gives me some idea of how I might shape it. And I think the real thing about knowing the score if you're going to conduct it, you can make your own choices about all these things. You don't have to buy my analysis. Right? But the more you go about some way getting the piece, right, some concept of how you want it to be played, right, the stronger you're going to be able to lead your band and orchestra. And I find that simple system of numbering measures a really quick way to orient myself to phrase structures. Right? So if we think about the end of the Holtz, by the way, which is, it's not a 16th variation, it's an extension, right? So I'm sensitive, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Or sometimes I'll think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is stretched, 8 is stretched. Does that make sense? And again, without being able to project it, but I'm attentive to asymmetrical phrase structures a lot, and I find that in my students, a lot of these things are feedback I've gotten from students over the years. It's simple tools like that can be really useful ways to map your understanding onto the score.